back to the Cuban medical issue program. The first sign that, listen, this was going to be caught up in the global dynamics, geopolitical muscle flexing of the Trump administration came last year when the Trump administration declared that the program should end in the Caribbean because it was tantamount to human trafficking. And that put pressure and turned the scrutiny on the details of the program. A number of Caribbean countries were forced to look at the program, look at the structure, look at the arrangements, and made changes. Now, we are learning that, listen, for over 50 years, we were party to the exploitation of the Cuban doctors and personnel. And it was a secret. How many of you knew, not me, that when the Cuban doctors and nurses came here and do the kind of job they were doing, we were not paying them. They were being paid through the Cuban government, and they were not getting what we were paying them, like how we pay all doctors and nurses here. But the Cuban government held on to up to half, if not more, of their monies, what their labor had earned them. We are now learning that their movement in Jamaica was restricted. Their passports were being held on to. Yeah, they could not form certain social relationships here in Jamaica. They were, and I think the word used by George this morning was most appropriate, they were in servitude. That cannot be right. That cannot be right. And there are now many questions for the Jamaican government to answer. When did we know that this was the arrangement that the Cuban doctors and nurses and personnel were being subjected to? When did we know that? And what did we do? According to the Jamaican Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, the Jamaican government only became aware of this recently, and that became a sticking point, which ultimately led to the Cuban government refusing to alter the payment arrangements, which led to the collapse and termination of the program. Is that so? Well, I've been trying to get the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and, I hope to be able to have a word with her. But when did we find this out? When did we find out that, listen, when we pay the Cubans, the money go to the Cuban government take what they want and give, according to this report, coming from this human rights organization, Cuba Archive. And let me tell you, I read that report and I was very wary while I was reading it, because we know a lot of politics is mixed up in this. So I'm not going to tell you I'm taking this report hook, line, and sinker. But the government of Jamaica, the Cuban ambassador, the Cuban government, must now come and tell us whether the basic thesis of that 44-page report by Cuba Archive, whether it's rubbish or not. Is it a fact that the Cuban doctors who come here do not get up to, if not more than 50% of their wages? They are allowed to retain only $200 US. How could that be? They're not allowed to have control and agency over their own movements. You hold on to their passports. Is that so? Huh? They are required to engage in political campaigning on social media for the Cuban government. Huh? They are required to live in poverty in Jamaica. Huh? While the Cuban government creams off, according to Cuba Archive, up to $4.5 billion of their monies. That is against international law. And one of the questions that the government of Jamaica since 1976, including the Michael Manley government, is being asked this morning, the Michael Manley government, under whose stewardship this came into being, and a pro-worker government. Michael Manley was a leading trade unionist in Jamaica. Michael agreed to this. Huh? This was exploitation because of his fraternal friendship and relationship with Castro's Cuba. We were party to the exploitation of workers in this way. Now, this is what is now exploding in front of us. And we can't hide away from it. And it went on for 50 years. What did the government of Jamaica know about these arrangements? When did they know about them? What did they do? Becomes pertinent. It cannot be that we're going to accept this because we like the Cubans, we support the Cuban people, we recognize the Cuban people, and we must take part in this illegal exploitation of people. No Jamaican would agree for when we'll send our farm workers to Canada or US, for the Jamaican government to take 50-60% of their money, and tell them can only get 10% of it to use. No Jamaican would, we not supporting that. And this thing has mushroomed in a way that we now have to get answers. For 50 years this thing went on for. And it is as a result of the Trump administration zeroing in on it. Zeroing in on it and say, listen, this is human trafficking. The report this morning, the report I read describes it as modern day slavery. I wouldn't go that far, but it's not far from it. Yeah? It is servitude. Anyway, this is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs report responding to the Cuban government, accusing the Jamaican government of terminating the program. Here's Siobhan Campbell's report.
The Foreign Ministry says the Cuban medical program was terminated after failed efforts to restructure it and bring it in line with Jamaican law and international labor conventions. It says the decision followed months of engagement with the Cuban government in an attempt to change the payment structure for Cuban medical personnel. The Jamaican government was also insisting that the Cuban health workers had control of their travel documents. This after concerns were raised that some Cuban workers on the island were not initially in possession of their passports. The Foreign Ministry says once the issue was brought to its attention, steps were taken with immigration authorities and Cuban officials to ensure the workers were allowed to hold their own travel documents. In echoing Friday's disclosure from the health minister, the Foreign Ministry says the more significant issue was how the Cuban workers in Jamaica were paid. According to the Kamina Johnson-Smith-led ministry, while salaries for Cuban medical personnel were calculated at the same level as their Jamaican counterparts, the payments were made by Jamaica to Cuban authorities in US dollars. Overtime payments were the only earnings paid directly to the workers. The ministry says there was no contractual provision specifying what portion of those payments went to the workers themselves. This raised concerns on the Jamaican labor and tax laws, as well as international labor conventions. The Holness administration reportedly attempted to address the matter through diplomatic engagement. Formal discussions began in July last year with the aim of restructuring the arrangement so that Cuban medical personnel would be paid directly and retain control of their travel documents. Following cabinet deliberations, the government submitted a formal proposal in October and sent follow-up communications in December. The Holness administration also made direct inquiries to both former and current Cuban ambassadors and held informal discussions at the ministerial level. But despite those efforts, there was reportedly no substantive response from Havana. At the same time, Jamaica said it became aware that other Caribbean countries had arrangements in place under which Cuban medical personnel were paid directly. It says this suggested that a compliant arrangement was possible. The Holness administration says it could not justify the existing arrangement given its legal obligations and its responsibility to ensure fairness to workers. It concluded that continuation of the program under the existing terms was untenable. The Holness administration says it is disappointed that Cuba chose to withdraw its medical workers from Jamaica when the only requirement for the program to continue was agreement to terms already accepted in other Caribbean states. Despite the breakdown in the arrangement, Jamaica said it remains committed to cooperation with Cuba and reiterated its appreciation for the contribution Cuban medical professionals have made to the country's healthcare system. Siobhan Campbell for Nationwide News.
So, thank you, Siobhan. So the Cuban government has made the changes where the program is concerned in other Caribbean countries, but is refusing to do so where Jamaica is concerned? Why? Why? Why would it? Huh? I saw a clip last night. I don't know if you have that for me, Nora, where the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, made clear that the arrangement with Barbados is one in which the workers are paid, by Barbados, the same terms and salaries earned by Barbadian doctors. So, a lot of questions to be asked and to be answered by the Jamaican government, because we're now learning things that we didn't know before. When did Jamaica become aware of these exploitative arrangements between the government of Cuba and the doctors and nurses? For how long did we put up with this? Huh? No. So, in the debate, we have to recognize as well, we have to give Rubio and Trump some credit here, because we heard first that something was amiss from Trump and Rubio, his Secretary of State. That's when we heard first. And I notice the the Jamaican government did not come out and fully declared what we are learning until the Cuban government last week came out and said no, challenging the Jamaican government's position on the termination of the program. So I look forward to hearing from the Jamaican government. We have made a call out for the foreign minister, but she's in London on the government of Jamaica business. In the meantime, the opposition spokesman on foreign affairs is Senator Donna Scott Motley. Well, she's calling on the government to outline the effects the ending of the Cuban medical program will have on the local health sector.
The public must also be informed of the practical implications of this decision. The country must be assured that there are clear and effective plans in place to maintain continuity of care, particularly in facilities where Cuban medical professionals have been providing important services.
Yes, they have been. Yeah? But Mrs. Motley, you need to speak as well to the exploitative arrangements that these Cubans were subjected to, and whether your government, when it was in office, agreed and with knowledge that these were the arrangements put in place, where the doctors and the nurses are saying, listen, they didn't have a choice. They were presented with contracts that they didn't even get a chance to read. They had to sign. And their monies were usurped, taken by the Cuban government. And they were given pittance. That is the issue now. Is that so? And was that the governments of Jamaica signed on to from 1976 until 2023? Time for the break.